you see that? Cool. Okay. So yeah, this talk is about localizing unsplash.com with a little asterisk because a lot of the work wasn't done by me or the web team. It was done by the API team. I'm not going to be talking about that. I'm going to be talking about kind of how we localized the static parts of the website, I guess, and not the dynamic data. With a focus on how we actually use types in lots of different ways to enforce correct translations, and we'll see what that means. So this is the Spanish version of the website. I'm sure everyone is familiar with this. And you have, text from the API, like in the subnav at the top, the topics, that's translated, but that's translated by the API. And then you've got kind of static text, like around the search input, that is kind of on the website, and that's for the web team to translate. And one thing I think is important to keep in mind, like as we're talking about this, is we localized the website with 0 runtime libraries. So we didn't use one of these massive JavaScript libraries to do this. And I think that's unique, and I think it's worth pointing out. And we'll see how we get there. But I think like that's kind of a key takeaway, I think, is like there is no runtime. So I'm going to break this down into 4 sections. I'm going to talk about how we format data using the ECMAScript internationalization API. And we're going to talk about how we translate messages. So you can think of messages as like sentences. And that was using something called the ICU message syntax. I'm going to talk about how we turn messages, the ICU messages, into functions using something we built called Intl C. Just turn my screen off. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how we enforce translations across the whole website using new types. And these, they might sound quite vague, but we're going to get into the details of each one. So the first thing is like formatting data using the ECMAScript internationalization API, or just Intl for short. So if we look at the Unsplash website, look at notifications, you have things like dates, and dates need to be formatted. So, and there are 2 different types of date formatting. There's relative, which you see at the top, and there's absolute that you see at the bottom. And we need to translate that. So this is the Spanish version. At the top, again, we have the same notification, but there's a relative time in Spanish. And then at the bottom, we've got an absolute time in Spanish. And we can do this using the ECMAScript internationalization API. So intl.datetime format, you give it a locale, you give it a date style, and there are many different styles, and you give it a date, and then it returns an absolute formatted date. So at the top, we have an example of a short and full date in English, and at the bottom, we have an example of the same thing, but in Spanish. And then for relative times, there's another API called internationalization relative time format, and you give it a positive or a negative number. So at the top, I'm saying 5 hours. You give it a unit like hours or minutes, and then it returns a relative time like in 5 hours or 5 hours ago if you gave it a negative number. And then again for Spanish. So we don't have to worry about translating these because it's done by these APIs. And then another example of kind of formatting data would be a list. So here we have a list of 3 items. And we can use the intl.listFormat API, and we can say it's a conjunction list, which means kind of all of the things together. And it's going to give us that kind of formatted list where we have the comma separated items with the word and before the last item. You can also do type disjunction. So that would be motorcycle, bus, or car instead of and car. And then again, we can just change the locale, and we have the same thing in Spanish. Another thing we need to format is numbers. So here we have on the search page the number of photos that appear for this search term for 3.9 thousand. And in English, when you kind of abbreviate a number in that way, you do 3.9K. But in Spanish, you don't want to do a dot, you want to do a comma. So we have an API for this as well, for formatting numbers. Let's look at some more examples. So we have here, again, we have some larger numbers in English. These are 2 million, and we have percentages as well. And in Spanish, those million numbers that we looked at, we need to use a dot instead of a comma. And with the percent, we need to actually have a space before the percent. So the Intl.number format API kind of handles all of this for us as well. And it can format lots of different types of numbers. You can do, if you have 5 megabytes, you can say style megabytes, and it will make sure that the formatted number is correct for the locale that you provide. Another example of kind of formatting data is when we have situations like this, where if there's one photo, we just, it's singular, so we say one photo, but if it's more than one or less than one, we need to say plural, so 5 photos. And how do we know, do we display the word photo or photos? And there's an API for this called intl.plural rules. You give it a number and it tells you which plural category that number kind of belongs in. So every language has its own plural categories. English has 2, it has one and other. So one would be one, and then every other number is other. Here we're looking at the same kind of thing, but for Czech, and Czech has 3 plural categories. So you can see when we say 0, it's other. When it's 1, it's 1. If it's 2, 3, or 4, it's going to be few. And if it's 5, then it's other. And so every language has its own kind of rules about this. I think it's defined in the CLDR, which I'll talk about now. So these internationalization APIs that we're just looking at, under the hood, they use something called ICU. And ICU stands for International Components for Unicode. And that is a library for C, C++, and Java. And that's how these internationalization APIs are working under the hood. They're actually using ICU. That's how they're implemented. And these ICU components, they use something called CLDR, which stands for Common Locale Data Repository. And that basically defines, data for all of the world's languages, things like how to represent numbers and dates and the word for different days of the week and that sort of thing. So we've looked at how we kind of format data, but we need to translate more than just dates and numbers. We need to translate messages. And with this, ICU provides something called the message syntax. So a message is like a user visible string, and it might have variable elements in it. So an example would be something like this, where we say your one photo has been published under the Unsplash license. We have a variable here, which is the number of photos. And we have another variable, which is kind of the link, because the translator only cares about the text inside the link, and the things around the link, that's kind of like a variable. And then if that number is, more than 1 or less than 1, the text around the number needs to change. So instead of your one photo has, it should be your 5 photos have been published under the Unsplash license. So it's important to point out, like it's not just putting a variable into the sentence. You need to think about the whole sentence depending on that number. If we were to kind of represent this as code, we would do something like this. So this is how we used to build the website. Maybe not exactly like this, because we write React components instead of HTML strings, but a very similar idea. So, you have your static words, and then you have interpolated inside of that, you have kind of logic to say, if the photo is 1, then I'm going to display this text. If it's 2, then I'm going to display some other text. And the problem is this is code. Like, we can't give this to the translator because the translator isn't a programmer. They don't care about the code. They are only interested in the words, and they're not interested in like the logic or the implementation details. So if we gave them this, then they could break it. They could break the code. They could change the href. They could change the class name, which would break our styles. This is kind of what we're interested in translating, is just the static words. And the first idea, I think, would be to just kind of split it up into separate messages and send it to the translator. And then when we get these separate strings translated, we get them back, we'll concatenate them together to kind of create the final sentence. But that's not a good idea. And the reason why that's not a good idea, we need to look at a simpler example. So if we look at a message like this, so an action might be something like, downloaded or viewed. So this sentence might say, John downloaded no photos, or John viewed no photos. It's a bit of a weird example. I need to find a better example, but hopefully you get the idea. So if we sent the translator these two strings, John and no photos, they might send back something like this for Spanish, because what you see here, sin photos, that is the translation for no photos. But that's incorrect. That's actually the wrong translation. The translator needs to know that these two words are going to appear together in order to give us the correct translation. And we can see what the correct translation would be in Google Translate. And we can see the word no appears before the translation for downloaded or viewed. So the order of the sentence actually changes for that language. And there was no way that the translator would be able to do that if we gave them those two separate strings and then concatenated them together. And kind of the ICU message syntax documentation kind of says exactly what I've just said, which is it's a bad idea to concatenate things because translators won't be able to rearrange the sentence, and they're not going to have the context to understand how the different strings relate to each other. Another problem with that code, if we were to just send that to the translator, is it's only handling two plural categories at the moment. It's only handling one and other. And other languages, as we saw earlier, like Czech has 3 plural categories, Japanese only has 1. So the translator would need to change this condition to handle that. They would need to say, okay, well, if the number of photos is 2 or 3 or 4, then I'm going to display a different string. So hopefully it's clear why we can't send this to the translator. This would actually be the Czech translation of that sentence we saw earlier. Your 5 photos have been published under the unspecial license. And you can see the words before and after the number are different depending on the number. So in other languages, it's not just as simple as English. I'm sure you guys know this because you know other languages and I only know English. So this is all new to me. So we looked earlier at ICU and how the ECMAScript internationalization API uses ICU under the hood. And ICU actually provides a solution for this, and it's called the ICU message format. And in the Java, C, and C++ libraries for ICU, they have a message format class. Well, obviously, we can't use that because we're not writing Java, C, or C++. But what's interesting is they define a kind of special syntax for these messages. And it looks like this. And this is a really simple, you can invent this stuff. You wouldn't think there's a standard for this. Like, we've all worked with stuff like this before. Here, name is just a string. So it's like an argument. But where it gets interesting is if we look at some more complex examples. So that example we looked at earlier, your number of photos have been published under the unspecial license. The ICU message would look something like this. So the syntax, just to explain quickly, you have kind of inside the braces, you have the variable name, which is photos. You have a type, which is plural, and then you have your kind of your cases or your categories. So when the number matches the plural category 1 for this language, we're going to display the text hash photo has. And that hash will just be the number. That's just sugar syntax for the number. And if that number, photos, matches the other plural category, then we'll display the other text in the other braces. So it's kind of like a switch statement. And then for the link that we saw earlier, you can see that we've kind of abstracted the details. Like the translator can't see the href and they can't see the class names. They can't change that. They can't break it, which is great. It's a lot simpler for them, but they still have the flexibility to move things around. This is how you would translate that to Spanish. So you can see that the variable name hasn't been translated. None of the syntax for the ICU message has been translated. It's just the text, that's actually shown to the user inside the braces. That is what the translator will translate. Spanish has the same number of plural categories as English. So here we only see one and other. But something like Japanese that only has one plural category, you would have something like this. You don't need to say one because there isn't a plural category called one for Japanese. There's only one plural category, which is called other. Some other kind of syntax features in ICU messages, you can, as well as plurals and strings, you can say something as a number. So just here I'm saying the variable name and then comma and then the type, which is number. And then when we render this message, we know to actually format that number using that internationalization number format API that we looked at earlier. So the type in ICU message is used to format the value. Another example would be dates. So here we're saying we have a date, the variable is called end, the type is date. And then you can, as a third argument, optionally, you can kind of specify what kind of date you want. And this matches the date time format API that we looked at earlier, where you can specify different date styles. So you can say things like short, long, full. Another thing you can do with ICU messages is kind of like switch statements. So this is really useful for things like gender. So imagine that we needed to display the message, Thomas invites you to his party. But if that host is, different gender, you need to change that word his to something like her or their. So that's kind of what the select syntax lets you do. So here we've got a gender of host variable, and we're saying the type is select, and then we kind of have a case for each value that we want to match against. So when the value of gender of host is female, then we're going to display the text her. When it's male, we're going to display his, and when it's other, we're going to display their. Okay, so this is kind of, just to bring this all together, this is like a more complex example of an ICU message where we have a string variable, we have a select, we have HTML tags, we have another HTML tag that has a date inside of it, so you can actually nest things. And then we have a plural. And I haven't covered the whole syntax here. There's actually quite a bit more, but I think this is enough for you to kind of get an idea of what we're trying to do here. So we've looked at ICU messages, but how do we actually kind of display them and render them on the website now that we've got them back from the translator? We need to inject these variables. How do we do that? And there is actually a proposal for something standard that would solve this problem called the message format class, just like the message format class in Java. It's just a proposal at the moment. It's just stage 1. And the way it would work is kind of like this. You can see the comment says it's still under development. Like, this is all subject to change. But we have something similar to the plural syntax that we saw earlier, where we're matching on the number, and we're saying, depending on the plural category, we want to display different text. So we define our message using this syntax. And then in JavaScript, we can just pass in that syntax as a string. And then we can kind of render that message called new notifications, and we can pass in the argument. So we're saying count is 1. And then it prints our string. But this is just a proposal, like we can't use this today. And so we kind of went to the drawing board and looked at all these other solutions that we have in JavaScript. And there are lots of different solutions, as always in JavaScript. Sometimes you have a lot of solutions, but the quality isn't always there. You've got Polygot from Airbnb, you've got FBT from Facebook, we've got Format.js from Yahoo. And all of these kind of use ICU messages, not all of them, but most of them. So over the Christmas holidays, I think like we were frantically trying to evaluate all of these different options. And there are so many trade-offs here, like code splitting and performance and compatibility with TypeScript and compatibility with React. But the big problem was type safety. And you probably hear us talk about this a lot on the web team. The problem with a lot of libraries in JavaScript is that type safety is always an afterthought. Whereas we kind of think of it as a first-class citizen because we really care about type safety. Like we want to, make our software resilient and make sure that we don't ship bugs to production that are going to result in runtime exceptions. And this is a problem even with the message format proposal. So even if that stuff wasn't a proposal and we could use it today, I'm not sure if we would. And just to kind of, just to elaborate on what we mean by no type safety. So this is the message format proposal that we looked at a minute ago, and we have a message called new notifications, and it has an argument called count, and then we're going to render that message and we're going to provide the count. But what happens if we forget to pass it? What happens if we pass it, but we pass the wrong type? We pass a string instead of a number. It would probably blow up at runtime. And you have the same problem, a very similar problem with these libraries like Format.js. Here we have an ICU message, and we're correctly providing the count variable to render this message. With Format.js, they do have a lint rule that catches mistakes, like if you forget to pass a parameter. So here I forgot to pass count, and the lint rule is going to shout at me. But it doesn't tell us if we pass the wrong type, because it's just not capable of that. Like it's just, you need TypeScript to do that. I think for them to solve this problem, they would need to essentially rebuild TypeScript. I filed an issue because I thought Format.js is a really great library, but this is a bit of a showstopper. So I filed an issue. Unfortunately, the issue was closed by Stalebot. So make of that what you will. So, thinking about this problem that, we want something type safe to render these ICU messages. If you really think about it, messages are just functions. Like in functional programming, everything is a function. So messages can be functions too. What do we mean by that? So let's take this ICU message. We have 2 parameters, name and age. Name has a type of string. Age has a type of number. And you can write this as a TypeScript function, just like that. It's just a function that receives 2 parameters and returns a string. It's not ICU message anymore. This is just JavaScript. Actually, the real version would be a little bit more complicated because you need to make sure that you format the number using the internationalization APIs that we looked at earlier. But you get the idea. And then this is how we would use that function. So we just pass in the parameters and it prints or returns that string. If we forget to pass in a parameter, TypeScript will tell us. If we pass in a parameter, but we give it the wrong type, so here it's expecting a string, we're providing a number, TypeScript will tell us. So we had this idea of, what if we could convert ICU message strings into functions or into code? And Sam had the idea of building a compiler to do this, which sounds like a really big task, but I think we got a proof of concept in like a week. And that's what Intl C is. It's a internationalization compiler. So it takes ICU messages and turns them into code. And it's not just TypeScript, it can compile this into any language. If you think about the type, like when we looked at the ICU messages, if we go back a little bit here, we have these types. So we're saying age is a number, and that type is used for formatting. That's what the purpose of that type is. So we know when we render the string that variable needs to be formatted as a number. But we can use that type information to generate the types as well. So that's what we're doing in Intl C. And yeah, it's written in Haskell because why not? Like, it's we really enjoy functional programming on the web team, and there's a lot that we can learn from using a language that supports functional programming as a first-class citizen. And Sam has been teaching us all, how to write Haskell, and that's been really good fun. And I think we have sessions every couple of weeks. We should do them more frequently, but if anyone is interested and wants to join, then you're more than welcome to. So this is how Intl C works. So you have a JSON file and it has ICU messages inside. So here we have two keys. We have hello and notifications. And then each of those objects have a message property, and that message property holds the ICU message. And you can also have a description. So the translator has more context, and they know, maybe they don't know where on the site the message is going to appear. So you need to give them a description of just to give them more context. So this is what we would give to the translator. We can then convert this JSON file into a TypeScript file by running this command. So Intl C compile, we specify the locale. In this case, it's enus. We specify the path of the JSON file, and then it prints to standard out. And then we're just going to save that to a TS file called enus. And this is what it looks like. So it's turned that JSON file into two functions, into a TypeScript module with two functions, two exports, hello and notifications, and they have types. The arguments have types, and they're just functions that return a string. It's a really simple idea. And you can see under the hood, we're using this ECMAScript internationalization API that we looked at earlier to format the numbers, to figure out what the plural categories are and what category we need to render based on the language. This is kind of how Intl C is working under the hood. So it takes a string of JSON, it parses that into JSON, it then has to parse the ICU message string into an AST, and then we can convert that AST into anything. We can convert it into any language. At the moment, we support TypeScript and TypeScript React, but it's just a compilation. Like, you can convert that AST into any other AST. So I don't know if I mentioned this before, but Intl C, it's not tied to TypeScript in any way. Like, it's just about compiling ICU messages into code. So this could work in any language. And there's a link at the bottom there that kind of describes the architecture of Intl C if you're interested. This is how you would use one of the generated files that comes from Intl. So it's just a regular module. So you just import it like a regular module, and then you just call the functions that are on that module, and you pass in the parameters and they return the messages. So we have our English file and we send it to the translator, and then they send back something like this in Spanish. It has the same syntax, just the words have been translated. And again, we run Intl compile. This time we specify the locale as Spanish, and we're going to save it to a Spanish TS file. And that's going to generate, again, it's going to generate a TypeScript module that has these exports, just like we saw before, but the messages are Spanish instead of English. Now, we need to kind of decide, are we going to use the English functions or the Spanish functions? So we can define a function that is basically a switch over the locale. And if it's English, then we're going to return the English module. If it's Spanish, we're going to return the Spanish module. Oh, didn't mean to go back there. So going back to our usage, you would just update it to import from the index file. You use that get messages function that we saw. You pass in the locale, and you can change the locale dynamically. So at the moment I'm saying in US, but if I change it to Spanish, the usage stays the same, but it's going to return the Spanish messages. One really nice property about this is we're using TypeScript to validate that our translations are up to date. So what would happen if we added another message to the English file, but we forgot to add the same message to the Spanish file? Well, you would compile that JSON into TypeScript, and then TypeScript here is going to say those two objects have different signatures. So we would get a type error to say that your Spanish translations are out of date because of this type signature that we have, that we're saying every return value of this function needs to have the same type as the English version. Likewise, if we updated an English message and we added another argument in there to one of the messages, and we forgot to update the Spanish version, TypeScript would return a type error here again, because these two translation modules needs to have the same signature. Otherwise, TypeScript is going to tell us that there's a mismatch and then they're not in sync. Okay, right, the final part to talk about is, and this is very quick, and I'm probably not going to do a very good job explaining this because this is kind of a bit of a complex idea, I think. So it's how we enforce translations using something called new types. So the idea is that we have these React components across the code base, and they have strings inside of them. And how do we know that we haven't forgotten to translate one of them? We've just got strings everywhere. Like, how do we know? Well, there are two types of strings here. You've got, in green, you've got like the code strings, and they don't need translating because they're just code, like the image source and the anchor rel attribute. That's just code, like that's not going to be translated. But the title or the alt or the text inside of the link, that's all going to be user facing, and that does need to be translated. So once you make this distinction that there are two different types of strings, in type systems, we can differentiate between that. We can create a new type, and we can say we have a string and we have a special type of string, which we call internationalized. And you see here it's Intl ZD. That's just short for internationalized. And you don't need to worry about the details here, but the thing to look at is on line 7, where we have a function that receives a type of internationalized. And when we try to just pass a string inside of there, TypeScript doesn't let us. It says argument of type string is not assignable to type internationalized. But on the next line, we're passing in a string that's been wrapped. So we've declared this string as being internationalized, and it does let us pass that in. So we have this distinction between two different types of strings, and we have to kind of declare a string is safe to display on the website. So going back to our components, if we take this idea, we can basically wrap these React components and say the prop type, say image has an alt prop, that isn't going to be a string anymore. That's going to be internationalized. So if you try to pass a string, it's going to give you an error. And you can see that alt is underlined in red because TypeScript is saying you're passing the wrong type. But source, there's no error there because it just wants a string. And then this is how we would fix those type errors. We would just use our the functions generated by Intl C, and they actually return a type of internationalized. So the type system knows that it is safe to use those values inside of those props. And this simple idea is really powerful because once we update the whole code base to use these components that we've defined for image and anchor elements and divs and spans, we've updated every component to use that. You can just run TypeScript to do the type checking, and you will get a very long list of all of the things that need translating. And then you can't miss anything. So this is kind of the end now, like just to go over what I've talked about. I think what I really like about the solution that we found is we're using types in lots of different ways to enforce correctness. So we use them to make sure that the arguments to our messages have the right type. And we use types to make sure that when we update the English messages, we don't forget to update the other languages. And we use types to make sure that we've translated every user-facing string and we haven't forgotten to translate anything. And that's it. That's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, I do have several questions. Well, first, brilliant talk. Loved it. I told you this before, but I knew you were going to put us all to shame for the next one. So the next one needs to be up to this level, and it's going to be very hard. But well, I wonder how using something as bleeding edge as this became an issue with the translation team, because I expect them. I mean, I don't know the nuts and bolts of how they work, but I smell like a regex somewhere, or just someone going line by line changing stuff. Yeah. So I wonder, how was it?
Yeah, it's been painful. So we send these JSON files to the localization team at Getty, and the team are really helpful. Like when we were getting started, they explained a lot of things that were new to us, and but when they receive these JSON files, they kind of pass them on to the translators, and the tool they use has to parse these ICU messages to display them in some, like, think of like a spreadsheet where you have a column for English and a column for Spanish, and they don't show the ICU message like syntax in that UI. They basically kind of try to hide it, and you'll just see like a blue box of a number, and then if you hover over it, you can see what it's hiding. But so the translator would only see the actual words, but that kind of worked initially. But the more advanced uses of ICU that we found, not even that advanced, to be honest, we started to discover that it was a bit of a hack on their side to support ICU messages, which is really surprising to us because it's a standard. Like we're not using something bleeding edge here. Like the ICU message syntax isn't anything new. Every other most of the other options we looked at used ICU messages. So it's not even because we decided to write a compiler. Like it's just about the syntax that we're using. So yeah, well, there are kind of ongoing issues of that, and we've been able to work around it to some extent on our side by limiting how we use ICU messages and making sure that we don't do anything too advanced. And they've been able to work around it on their side to some extent by basically manually pre-processing and post-processing. So when they receive the JSON from us, they might like remove the braces, and then when it's translated, they'll add them back in, and that's done manually, and that is very error prone. So
really, there's a
not
poor soul doing that.
that's as far as I understand, but it's not done in every case. It's only when the regular expression or whatever it is can't handle the syntax that we're sending. So there are other translation vendors out there that do support ICE messages as a first-class citizen. So that's something like we've been thinking about and talking about is, would we be better off using something like that? But for that to happen, the localization team at Getty would need to be trained on like a different suite of tools, and that's kind of the friction that we have at the moment. But at the moment, it's going okay. Like we managed to do Spanish. There was a bit of back and forth. We've ironed out some problems. We're just going to see how we go with the next few languages.
And I wonder if you check the performance differences between Format.js and this current Intl C implementation, because with what you mentioned, that the caveat with Format.js was types, but I wonder if with this pipeline of conversions, you also gain some performance during rendering.
Yeah, so with Format.js, you have, I'll bring up my slides again, hang on. Here we go. Okay, this is kind of Format.js, and you can see we're actually giving it the string at runtime. So in order to render this message, the library has to parse the ICU message into an AST at runtime, and that is costly. Format.js is one of the few libraries that actually recognizes that, and they provide the option of like pre-compiling it. And what that will do is it will replace this string with the AST representation. So at runtime, there isn't any parsing to do, but I think it's still not great because the AST can be quite large. It's like a really big object for a message like this. So it would increase the bundle size. Yeah.
Interesting.
So I think our solution is, I mean, I'm biased here, but I think it's better in all counts, like performance, type safety, code splitting is another problem. Like, what if we want to, only Spanish users should only download the Spanish messages. They shouldn't have to download the English messages as well. And because with the solution we came to, it's just TypeScript. So you can just do code splitting like you normally would. You don't need any special registry of JSON files or anything like that. So yeah, I in terms of performance, I think, as far as I can tell, I think what we've come up with is probably better.
Very, very interesting. Also, I mean, we have to acknowledge that this is very faithful to the Unix philosophy. So you have different pipes and layers on this instead of just a single responsibility thing. That awesome talk and awesome project.
Yeah.
Thanks. All right.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Just like, I guess, like comments like on my side on iOS, it's kind of like the same philosophy of like, for example, plurals and dates and that kind of thing. Xcode exports automatically some strings, like if we use a macro, specific macro, so it just exports the files. It also, with the Swift UI, like when you use a text component, it also automatically exports the string. And then it generates what's a file that's kind of like an XML, like basically it generates several files. And then it's compiled into an XLIF file, which is an XML format that defines all these separate files. And that's what I sent to the localization team. So in that sense, it seems a bit easier, but I haven't like, I had to go like there's a couple of things that are different. It's like type safety for parameters. I don't have that. Or like, I think it's, like, no, it's going to break at runtime. And there was something else. But yeah, type safety, that's one of the things. And we'll see, because like I just sent an XLIF file to the team and I'm waiting. So we'll see, like if I have to go, like there's going to be a lot of back and forth with the team. But yeah, I didn't like it. Like I guess Apple hadn't thought about a lot of those things, so I didn't really have to like to do as much research as you did.
Yeah, I'm very jealous.
But if I wanted to have type safety for the parameters, like I would have to do something on my own, I guess.
Yeah, I looked at that video you sent, and I'm really impressed by what they've done. I don't think we have the option of doing that. And like I think with Swift, they can. It's called type directed emit, so they can change the resulting code based on the types. But with TypeScript, they can't do that. Like that's just a limitation of TypeScript. You can't change the code, the output code based on the type.
Yeah, Swift is a type-based language, so it's the base. It's typed. So
yeah.
It's
I'm very jealous.
Yeah, it's good. Like sometimes it's kind of annoying. Like gonna jump like to I guess like Thomas' message yesterday with the API team, like about like the results of photos and that kind of thing. Like sometimes with some payloads and you're expecting something that can be so like with API, sometimes there can be some issues. But yeah, it's
yeah. All right.
Thank you, man. That was pretty great. Like I had no idea about like all of that. It almost feels like a new language just to tackle like internationalization. So that's great. Yeah, thanks a lot. It was really interesting.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I got a question, kind of just ending here. Is do you guys have any plans on promoting this Intl C NPM? I don't know. It's a library, I guess, technically, right? It stands on its own. Is there plans to kind of make it a bigger deal, or just see where it goes on its own?
Yeah, I personally think it has a lot of potential. So that's kind of why I wanted to write this talk, and I'm going to try and give this talk externally as well. Like I said, I think Intl C is not just about TypeScript, so it could benefit other languages as well.
Yeah, I think this it's a really fun, very digestible presentation. I'm not in the JavaScript TypeScript world, and I got so much from it because it's I think it doesn't matter what language you're dealing with. If you're dealing with internalization, you learn a lot from this. So yeah, I definitely think you should do this talk in any opportunity you have. It's an excellent piece.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I joined one of the Haskell sessions. That was awesome. I'm actually learning Haskell just because of that, and thanks to Sam. So if anyone wants to join, I will go with you again. Face the dragon.
Yeah, we started just building like a very small version of Intl C from the ground up, like assuming that you know no Haskell, and just taking baby steps. Like, how do you parse a string that just says hello name, and then just starting from there. So yeah, I definitely think there's a potential for like everyone to benefit from those sessions, and Sam is really good at teaching as well. Like he's very patient. So yeah.
So now that this is the first step, hopefully for many more talks, I know how we want to manage the next ones. If this like vote, or let's just flip up coin, or
it doesn't have to be about programming, I believe, right? That's kind of the rules is something that you do. I mean, it can be, maybe it should, I don't know. Do we have some set rules, house rules for this? Can it be about your, I don't know, what could it be? Boat, painting, coffee making?
I think we should allow that. Yeah. Yeah. That'd be more fun. I think we need to do something to keep it fun. If it's too dry, then like this talk that I just did, you know, I put a lot of time into that, and I don't think that's sustainable. So yeah, I think we need a bit of variety. Yeah.
Yeah,
I was thinking maybe like if you're curious, like making a small Swift app with a Swift UI like in an hour, so like a small thing. Like some are curious to know about how it works, because it's game changing. Like in terms of making iOS apps, it's very easy now.
I think that the goal with this, and for me it's very interesting, just to what we can learn from other languages or implementations of things. There are some very obscure things on API that are language agnostic, like visual search, or some of the unholy things we do with Tim to ingest gigabytes of data for the stats. So I think those are like abstract concepts that doesn't need you to really understand what's going on, even though if the first talk included Haskell, there's nothing we can do to make things harder. So
yeah,
I think it's good to know, like to be aware for each, like from each team, like to know what other teams are like the some of the challenges that each team have been facing over the past couple of years, you know, like, or like whatever we're working on, some of the things that it's always interesting to learn from each other, I guess.
Yeah, I have quite a few ideas as well, but I don't want to go next. We need a volunteer.
As you should.
Oliver?
Yeah, I'll go. I'll do it. I'll prepare something. Like I said, maybe a Swift UI, like code along or something like that.
That'd be good.
Yeah. How frequent? I did it 3 months because I was kind of like, I don't want it to be a burden. Is that too long to wait into the next one, or is that okay?
I think we can start with that. I mean, why not?
Okay.
We can always change it if we find that's too not often enough or whatever. Yeah. Cool.
All right. I'll send an invite for the next one, and I'll put your name down, Olivia.
Cool.
Good.
Thanks again, Ollie.
Thanks.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.